This is one of the weirdest, rarest, and yet one of the most fascinating cars ever produced. Tatra 613 Mi-Long Electronic. It has a large V8 engine, but it is not mounted under the hood, but on the rear axle. And it is air-cooled. Yes, air-cooled. And there are several reasons why this car has the word electronic in its name. Today we are going to discover the intriguing story and engineering of Tatra 613 Mi Electronic and explore this car near me, one of only the 17 ever produced, which I found in Prague, Czech Republic. Because I'm Toma and you are watching Timeless Driving. Development of this car began in 1968 to replace the gorgeous Tatra 603, a car that was adored especially by presidents and dictators all around the world.
Tatra 603 already had an air-cooled V8 engine mounted in the back, and it was a smaller one with 2.5 liters. But actually the recipe for the air-cooled V8 engines at Tatra dates back from the beginning of the 1930s, when the genius designer and engineer Hans Ledwinka, obsessed by the aerodynamic principles and helped by the aeronautic engineer Paul Geray, who worked on the Zeppelin airships, launched the Tatra T77. It was the most aerodynamic car of its time, when the form followed the function, and it had the first air-cooled V8 engine from Tatra to be able to attain a higher luxury segment. Back then, almost 90 years ago, that engine had overhead valves, which were driven by a single cam, positioned in the middle between the engine blocks. The engine itself was built from an alloy called electron, containing quite a lot of magnesium and allowing it to be one of the most rigid and light materials of its time. That engine had 3.0 liters, and it amazed the journalists in 1934 when they were invited to test the new model just as much as the aerodynamics of the car did. So at Tatra, genius and bold engineering was a typical feature, even almost a century ago. And after that, first Tatra T77, a list of other models followed. T87 in 1936 and then Tatra 603 in 1956, all of them having evolutions of the same idea of an air-cooled V8 engine. Tatra eventually experimented with a 4-cylinder boxer engine on Tatra T97 and on a much more popular model, T600 Tatraplan, in 1947, and those were rear-mounted and air-cooled as well. Tatra 603 was developed in secrecy by the engineers after they were told by the government that the factory should focus only on building its highly capable trucks with articulated axles, and in line with the same idea of the production of the Tatra plant has been moved to Skoda plant. The new socialist government in Czechoslovakia had declared that they would count on Soviet ZIS and ZIM for official needs. And in that atmosphere, the engineers have launched a secret project with the codename Valuta, which we could translate roughly as currency, and they started developing a new dream Tatra model for the new era of the 50s. And they were completely right to do so, because only after slightly more than a year of scarcely receiving some ZIS and Z models from USSR, the Czechoslovak officials were amazed by the poor quality of those and the small number of cars that the Soviet actually accepted to deliver them. So they reminded themselves of Tatra, and in 1953 called the guys from Tatra in their offices to say, "Could you return to production of the cars and develop a gorgeous new limousine that would serve as a flagman for state official purposes as well?" "Yeah, we could definitely start working on such a model," was the answer from Tatra, while it already had the design and sketches for the 603. That model was launched in 1956, and it became a symbol of lavish, extravagant presidents and dictators. Of course, it became a symbol of state cars in Eastern Bloc, but even Fidel Castro in Cuba had one and used it for a record period of time among all heads of state. Tatra 603 has been produced for 20 years, but even such a legend eventually needs a successor, so Tatra started their work on a new model that would match the reputation of the opulent 603.
But those shapes were not in trend anymore, so designers and engineers in Czechoslovakia of those times tried to look in the future to be ahead of those trends, and in 1973 they launched Tatra 613, a car that became loved by KGB spies thanks to its powerful V8 engine that allowed them to chase effectively.
Development of the Tatra 613 began in 1968, and by that time, Czechoslovak engineers gained so much courage and enthusiasm that they have contracted the Italian design team at Vignale to create the right shapes for a car of the future. In 1969, Italians built the first prototypes. In 1972, a first concept was shown to the public, and in 1973, Tatra 613 was officially launched. It stirred the public once again, attracting fascination since it brought something completely new from Tatra, with a body style closer to the French luxury liftbacks, but retaining its Czechoslovak originality and that unique idea of an air-cooled, rear-mounted V8. This time the engine was mounted a bit more in the front, to be on the rear axle, not behind it.
In 1973, this car already had multi-link suspension on the rear axle. Mercedes introduced that only 9 years after that, on the 190e model.
And the new model had 5.02 meters in length, which is even comparable to luxury limousines built many decades later. Thanks to the new engine position and some other changes, Tatra 613 gained a more balanced weight distribution with 55% in the back and 45% in the front. So the new Tatra had less problems with losing the grip on the front axle, and that made it a beloved model for secret agents, especially KGB. Well, since Tatra 613 was still a very hard to buy model if you are not a state official, having a black Tatra 613 following you in USSR was not really discreet, but rather meant that you have done something to be on their radar at a quite high level. Only KGB alone bought 500 of these cars. And Tatra 613 was a very expensive automobile in those times. A new Lada in Czechoslovakia would cost 58,000 crowns. A Volga Gaz 24, 105,000 crowns. A Gaz 13 Chaika, 118,000 crowns. But a Tatra 613 had a cost of 284,000 crowns. That is Rolls-Royce money and above. The engine was a 3.5-liter V8 debuting with a carburetor at first and delivering 168 horsepower. The car was a bit heavier than its predecessor at 1,650 kilograms or 3,640 pounds, but it reached 190 kilometers an hour or 118 miles per hour. In 1980, the first facelift came and the Tatra 613/2 was launched, /2 meaning the second iteration. In 1985, another facelift was launched with the Tatra 613/3. This time, besides the aesthetical updates, the engine received injection instead of carburetor. That increased the power from 168 horsepower to 200 horsepower and 300 Newton meters. A new 5-speed gearbox was installed, and thanks to all of that, Tatra 613 could reach a maximum speed of 230 km an hour or 143 miles per hour. At the beginning of the 90s, the model was about to reach 20 years again on the market, but these were times of change for Czechoslovakia. New Western models began to arrive, and Tatra now was perceived mostly like an ex-government car belonging to governments that represented a dusk of an era. Tatra hadn't the money and the time to develop a new model, so it chose to do another facelift, the Tatra 613/4. Soon after that, Tatra considered the idea of putting a stronger accent on long wheelbase models. Those models got the name Tatra 613 Mi Long, where Mi emphasized the injection of the engine and Long, of course, the stretched wheelbase. And on the base of the Mi Long, Tatra created the 613 Mi Long Electronic.
So what we see here today is one of the last iterations of this long-lived model. And Tatra then tried to go upscale and challenge the Western manufacturers. It was created at the beginning of the 90s and launched in 1993, so there was already a big competition on its home market. That's why Tatra decided to do the best to compete, even with models like Mercedes S-Class. And this Tatra has similar dimensions, 5.15 meters in length, so it's comparable to Mercedes S-Class and BMW 7 Series of that time.
Yes, what we explore today is a Tatra 613 Mi Long Electronic, so that means we are looking at a long wheelbase model.
A signature of Tatra models from the 1930s up until last models produced at the end of the 1990s was the rear-mounted air-cooled V8 engine. This iteration of Tatra 613 basically kept the same initial engine that it had in 1974 when it received injection instead of a carburetor. Let's have a look at it.
Well, it is the same engine as in 1973-74, but actually the injection arrived in 1985 for the first time. Thus, in terms of power, injection and engineering, it was the same as 1985, with its roots stretching 12 years earlier.
So it's a 3.5 liter naturally aspirated air-cooled engine. You can see the air ducts here and the cooling mechanism of the engine here. It developed 200 horsepower and 300 Newton meters, and this late iteration already had a 5-speed gearbox instead of a 4-speed. Because of the rear mounting of the engine, Tatra models had always a specific way of how they drove, with the front axle being too light and requiring attention not to lose the grip there. But Tatra 613 was much more balanced in that manner. This car has quite a high mileage, I wouldn't guess by just looking at it. It has 231,000 kilometers, or about 145,000 miles.
It is built in 1993, and I was told that it actually served the Czech officials back then. After that, it was sold at an auction and bought by an enthusiast, who brought it to today's condition.
So why is it called electronic? Well, because this Tatra model already had 3 computers on the board, which communicated between them through CAN bus, a system which is common today but was at the beginning back then.
This model was actually one of the first cars in the world to adopt this standard, and it is even more interesting what it was doing aboard. It had a lot of sensors to check the car and to gather data, so it could calculate fuel consumption, battery level, especially since you could order this Tatra with sophisticated blowpoint audio system, a CD changer, an onboard phone, and even television inside. And the most important alerts were not just visual or with an acoustic signal, it also had voice warnings.
You could be told, for example, that the fuel level is too low and you should be looking for a gas station, or that the oil temperature has reached 130 degrees Celsius, for example, and you should step a bit softer on the gas pedal to let the engine cool itself. There were sensors in the brakes to tell you when the pads were worn, and the system would know when the light would go off. And all of that was in 1993. Unfortunately, this particular example doesn't have all those options because, frankly speaking, they were a bit problematic. So a lot of cars got back to the factory to refit in a standard long Mi.
Yes, at Tatra it was a common practice that a car would return to the factory and be refurbished into a new version and get a second life. But you can see on these images what were the options that those 17 units of Tatra 613 Mi long electronic would have. All that luxury meant that this Tatra had a price which was above the Mercedes S-Class W140. And since Tatra struggled to affirm itself in the new era and was way too expensive, we can understand why there were only 17 units produced of this Tatra 613/4 Mi long electronic model.
Well, let's have a look inside this weird Tatra 613.
We can actually see all these electronic notifiers of the original functions of diagnostics and alerts. It even had a seatbelt reminder back then.
Let me show you how you would sit in the back seat of this Tatra. You could have a TV here, you could have telephone, you could have a stereo system from Blaupunkt. So everything you could imagine was available to order in this Tatra 613 Mi electronic.
And of course, thanks to the long wheelbase of the model, there was even more space here in the back.
The most important moment is here. Let's start this legendary Tatra V8 engine. what a sound! It is specific to Tatra. For those who hear it for the first time, it even can remind of you of a truck. But that's a sound of an air-cooled V8. You know, Czechoslovakia used to have one of the most talented engineers and designers in the world, and they often insisted in doing things in their unique way. Let's see how it feels to drive a Tatra. Well, you have to struggle to find the right gear, and sometimes you aren't sure what gear you have actually coupled. But that's the magic of this car.
It feels like a big car, but it doesn't bend too much in curves. And the suspension is very soft to ensure that supreme level of comfort.
So we are driving in the city traffic now in 2023 with a Tatra. Now I have to make a U-turn, and with this long car it might be a challenge. I think it warmed up a bit and it gets better now. The gearbox is switching much better.
But better didn't feel that way for too long. I think it is not a problem with the model, but rather with the car I drove.
So I have to skip the second sometimes, because I just don't find it fast enough.
Second gear was hard to find. Sometimes if I would direct the lever more to the right, like I would want to couple the fourth, I would actually find the second. And similar difficulties were with the upper gears as well. But when you drive a car of only 17 ever produced from that model, you can't be too pretentious. After all, that doesn't reflect the model itself.
Hearing the sound of the V8 engine in the back is quite different than in a Porsche. It resonates in a different way because of the body type and the way it was put there. It is truly something special in driving such a car.
Of course, Porsche never put V8s in the back, but even though, the sound of the engine in the Tatra feels much more resonant in the interior.
This car is as unique as it can get. Even back then, when it was in production, there was no other air-cooled, rear-mounted V8 car. But seeing and driving it now, one of the 17 only ever produced, and probably one of the few left, feels like one in a lifetime chance to touch and feel one of the greatest masterpieces ever made in automotive history.
It may be very well one of the very last Tatra 613 midi-long electronic alive, and even one of the last 613, even if counting all years and iterations. So for me, driving a Tatra now is a historic day. And this Tatra definitely reminds us all and proves why Czechoslovakia and later Czechia and Slovakia had been so advanced in car engineering and design during the last century.